Now, so far, I've been focused on East Asia, but we're going to turn our attention towards the West, start moving towards Europe. The Ottoman Empire was a behemoth. I'll pull up a photo of it. Here's your Ottoman Empire at its maximum extent. In its own day, the Ottoman Empire is, well, there are no superpowers until the Cold War. But if you were going to call something a superpower, it'd be them. They're the big scary in early modern Europe. They're the people who are knocking at the gates of Vienna, threatening to swarm in and Islamize Europe. Huge empire, multi-ethnic, fairly advanced, imposing armies, rich. And what happens to them? Well, over the centuries, the Ottomans, who have another Oriental despotism form of government, start to decline. They start to regress. By the 1800s, people are calling them the sick man of Europe. They're considered a great power, one of the big boys, but it's more out of respect for their past because they're not really one of the big boys anymore. They're like Spain, somewhat of a joke, a sad joke. By the end of World War I, they don't exist at all. One of the three big empires that collapses, along with the Austrians and the Russians. There are a lot of things that you could use to explain the decline of the Muslim world. And what I'm going to tell you is only a small part of the overall story. But it's useful because it's going to be a launching point to get us talking about Europe. The Ottoman Empire had a problem with its clergy. Now, Islam doesn't have an organized church in the same sense that Christianity had an organized church with like the Catholics and Orthodox and Lutherans and Anglicans. But what they do have is they have seminaries. They're called madrasas, Muslim universities. And Islam is as much a code of law as it is a religion. It's a political system as much as it is a religion. Because Islam doesn't just teach people about how things are to be run in the hereafter and about the morals they are to live by on earth, but it also contains rules to govern people's interactions, even in like commercial matters. There's inheritance laws in Islam. There's commercial codes in Islam. There's rules about lawsuits in Islam. This is one reason why you hear of Muslims agitating for Sharia law. It's not just about private religious law. It's not just about imposing morals. It affects the way they do business with each other too. And so, an Islamic an Islamic clergyman is as much a lawyer, as much a judge as they are a preacher. They have different titles: muftis, imams, ayatollahs, different ones for different sects, different ones for different exact purposes. But in general, even though they don't have an organized church, they do have the madrasas, and the madrasas are going to effectively accredit these preachers. Now, the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, the Grand Poobah, he relies on these people as his propaganda boys, right? Like every other pre-modern state, I say pre-modern, frankly, this lasts up into the modern world, really pretty much up until the Enlightenment. Like most governments of that time, the state's legitimacy is based on religion. And so the ruler has to listen to the religious authorities. If he goes against the will of the imams are going to go to the public and tell them that Allah does not like the Sultan anymore. And, maybe you should just get rid of him. They have him by the balls. And these moms have a bit of a problem because there's a new technology came out of China, funnily enough, called the printing press. And this printing press, actually, to be honest, I don't know if the Muslim printing press was a Gutenberg press or a Chinese press. It might have been a Gutenberg. We'll come back to that. The printing press is able to print books at hundreds of times the speed that a man can write them. In an era before the printing press, if you want to write a book, you have to write it by hand. If you need a copy of something, you get out your quill, you get out your inkwell, and you sit there at your desk and you go word by word until the thing is done. If you make a mistake, there's no way to correct it. Books are extremely expensive. Every single book is a tediously handmade product. And in a world like that, regular people can't afford books. And when people do make books, it's going to be very limited what they can do. You're going to make copies of textbooks. You're going to make holy scriptures. You're going to make copies of specific classics, the kind of junk that they would make you study in school now. What are you not going to make? You're not going to make technical manuals. You're not going to make political treatises. You're not going to make a whole lot of philosophy. Most information, most wisdom in a society like that is received from past generations. Things have to be very well proven in order to be worth considering spending that much effort on. It's going to be confined to libraries, like legit libraries, not private libraries. And when you don't have that many books, you're not going to teach regular people how to read. So this printing press, it has so much potential to change the world. Imagine if you could give everyone a copy of a textbook. Imagine if you could have engineers and scientists actually sending reports on the work they do to each other. You could make so much progress so fast. You could have so many more thinkers able to talk to everyone else. But that's the problem. Because the men in the madrasas want to control the flow of information. If any man can go read the Quran for himself, they might disagree with what the madrasas teach. They might have a different interpretation of it, and they might even circulate dissent. And so the imams are going to petition the Sultan to shut it down. And he does. And despite shooting his own country in the foot, he can do it because his country is so big that it's too big to fail. I feel way more pleased with myself for that than I should. I should go back and edit the Asia too big to fail. Mayday, mayday. 1, 2, 3. And it's just one part of the story of why the Muslim world falls so far, but it is a part of the story. And as we're going to see, in a different environment with different incentives, this is going to be a big part of the story of how a certain corner of Europe comes to flourish. And this leads me to the Protestant Reformation. You remember how I noted that Northern Europe did better? Well, there was a detail. I think I had intended to bring it up back then, but you're getting it now. There's a thing that Northern Europe has that sets it apart. And that's the choice of religion they adopt. And before we get into this, I want to make it clear to you all. This is all historical commentary. The main man who came up with this theory, this interpretation of history, is named Timur Kuran. Kuran is a cultural Muslim. He's not a Protestant. He's not a Catholic. He doesn't have a dog in this fight because he doesn't believe in Christianity to begin with. This is an argument about history. It should have no impact on spiritual truth, unless you want it to. But in many religions, they kind of take an ambivalent attitude towards worldly things like material possessions and wealth. I just want to make that clear, to hopefully avoid the potential for offense, because I know that in any given audience, you're going to have people of different denominations. Now, this was the map I should have shown you. You'll notice that there is a part of Europe that's richer than the rest. So Eastern Europe's poor. I already spoiled it for you. That's communism doing that. Actually, it was poorer to start with, but communism made it even worse. Southern Europe is not super poor, but it's not as wealthy as Northern Europe. And what does Northern Europe have in common? Well, you could attribute it potentially to common law. There are people who've argued that. You could attribute it to Germanic culture. But the explanation I've heard that has the most plausibility to me focuses on Protestantism, because Northern Europe is largely Protestant country. I didn't even notice this before, but yeah, I don't know a lot about the Baltics, but look at that. Lithuania and Estonia are both Protestant, and they're wealthier than Orthodox Latvia. I love it when I find more evidence for things I already believe. Something about the Protestant world is different. And that's what we're going to talk about now. So, in medieval Europe, sorry, not really medieval Europe, in modern Europe, they have the same conflict over the printing press that the Ottomans have. Catholic Church doesn't like it. Catholic Church doesn't particularly like literacy. Catholic Church doesn't particularly like people reading Bibles. In the church, well, in some ways, you could say that the church was kind of an empire in its own right. The Roman Church, which in the West would become Catholic, in the East it would become Orthodox, was essentially the one institution of the Roman Empire that survived. When Roman political institutions crashed, when Roman economic institutions crashed, when cultural, social institutions crashed, the one piece that lived, the one piece that managed to win the hearts of its own oppressors was Mother Church. And for a long time, Europeans lived with this sort of hybrid system where the church acted like a bureaucracy without borders. There was a legal code that was the king's, and there was a legal code that was the church's. There were courts for the king's laws, and there were courts for the church's laws. There were functions of government that were performed by the king, and then there were functions of government, mostly involving like welfare and, poor relief, that belonged to the church. In some ways, this was good. This division of power was much sharper in the Catholic world than in the Orthodox one. In the Orthodox one, the ruler of a country got to boss his patriarch around. In the Catholic world, in theory, the Pope is above the king. In practice, they fight over it. Often what you'd have is there would be a king who would be calling the shots with the Pope, and then the Pope would be calling the shots with whoever didn't control the Pope. But this added an element of competition to it. But at the same time, it did mean that they had some vestige of empire. They had some vestige of centralized authority. And that authority did not like other people having access to power and other people having access to learning. The Catholic Church is going to do a lot to promote science, but it's also going to do a lot to control society. And controlling access to written texts is going to go hand in hand with that. Now, along comes this German man, Johann Gutenberg, and he independently creates a movable type printing press. He creates something like the Chinese press, but better. And the initial reaction of the church is one of anger. Shut that down, especially when the press is used to circulate things critical of them. But the difference between Gutenberg's Germany and the Ottomans, Turkey, is that Gutenberg's Germany looks like this. You see this horror show? You see this vomit on the map? Those are all little countries. Well, kind of. They're all part of what's called the Holy Roman Empire. It's not Roman, it's not holy, it's not really an empire, but the Holy Roman Empire was kind of like the early US in the sense that it was a confederacy of smaller kingdoms that had a federal government that kind of kept the peace. In fact, they elect their emperor. The people don't, but the individual rulers, the dukes and archdukes and counts and landgrafs and all of them elect them. But Germany is an absolute mess. You literally have electors who are just a knight that owns his own lawn. You'll have some massive realm like Bohemia. Well, it's massive by, Holy Roman standards. You'll have a place like Bohemia or Austria or Brandenburg, and then you'll have literally a knight with his own house. Or you'll have a city that has its own independence. Or you'll have some other, a county. It is a very messy place. There are thousands of sovereign political entities, things that, if they existed today, basically they would have their own seat at the UN. You could compare the Holy Roman Empire to the European Union. They're their own country, but they also share a government as well. Gutenberg is working in this environment. And so, whenever the authorities catch up to his press, it's not necessarily him, but whenever there is a Gutenberg press operating somewhere and the authorities want to shut it down, they just move down the road because you have thousands of options, thousands of rulers. And with that many rulers, there is always going to be at least one who's willing to take you in. And this is critical because it's going to mean that there is no effective way to prevent dissent from circulating. And the fact that it's thousands of German states is important because they all share the same language. Language is not going to be a barrier here either. Now, for centuries, the Catholic Church has had problems with heresies. It's had problems with people starting to think for themselves, fight back. But the church always wins because the church is always fast enough that they can get in and suppress the heretics before they get out of control. They do this to the Cathars. They do this to the Waldensians. They do this to the Hussites. You don't know what any of those are, do you? Because they get shut down. But you know who the Lutherans are. You know who the Presbyterians are. You know who the Anglicans are. Well, that's the difference. What makes the Protestants of Martin Luther's era different is not so much what they're teaching or the anger of the public or anything like that. What it is the fact that they have a mouthpiece. They have the ability to speak out. So Protestantism becomes the religion of revolution, republic, and the bourgeois. And it becomes this because Protestantism is mostly going to be drawn from the merchant middle classes. For various reasons, these are the people who have little to gain from the current state of affairs, where one big church runs Europe like a one-party state, and they have the most to gain from shaking things up. And the thing is, there's a lot of rulers in Northern Europe who would also like to shake things up. The big powers of Europe, countries like the French and Spanish and Austrians, get a lot of say in how the papacies run. These people are kingmakers. Half the time, the Pope is told what to do by the King of Spain. Half the time, he's told what to do by the Austrians. If the French don't like it, they just pick some random guy off the street and call him a Pope. They're called anti-popes. But nobody goes and asks the ruler of Hesse-Kassel. Nobody asks the ruler of Denmark. Nobody asks the ruler of Scotland what they want, because they're small, they're far away from Rome. They just don't have the power. They're not a key to power. But these rulers see an opportunity. See, they don't have to participate in the system. They could secede from it, and then they'd have the keys to power. And they have this very angry, very radical, very fed up populace that would love to help them do it. And so in Southern Europe, when Protestants rise up, the rulers tend to side with the papacy against them. But in Northern Europe, the rulers tend to embrace it. And when the rulers don't embrace it, the people rise up and they take out the ruler. In Scotland, the transition to Protestantism is mostly peaceful. They develop their own church, the Presbyterian Church, and that goes on to form sort of the intellectual basis of what becomes Adam Smith's Scottish Enlightenment. In the Netherlands, those people have to fight their own war for independence from Spain, like we fight our war for independence against Britain. And they end up creating a federal republic like we do in America. And their federal republic has religious tolerance like we do in America. And it's a capitalist society like we have in America. The Netherlands is like a little US on European soil. In the long run, it ends up going back to monarchy because they're a little US that's surrounded by hostile foreign powers that are much bigger than it. But they put up a heck of a fight. They're one of the great powers from the moment they get founded because they're able to punch so far above their belt. Or sorry, so much above their weight. And the Dutch have the same Calvinist religion as Scotland. And the Swiss create a federal republic in the Alps, which is one of the richest countries in the world when it's founded. It stays that way. It's one of the richest countries in the world today. One of the freest countries in Europe. In the English, they have what is basically their own revolution. The king won't abide by the will of Parliament. The king won't respect the Constitution, won't respect the rights of Englishmen. Most of the rights that the founding fathers defend in the Constitution are really the rights of Englishmen. It's stuff that they had always had and the English were just trying to take away. Well, when the king tries to take stuff away from the English in England, they cut his head off. And they have a brief, several decade experiment with running the country as a Christian commonwealth under Oliver Cromwell. They run it as essentially a Christian republic in the same sense that the world has many Islamic republics today. And eventually the king comes back, but the king never has the same kind of power after he comes back. They're going to invite the monarchy back to stabilize the nation, But once Parliament has risen up, Parliament is never going to give control of taxation away again. Parliament is never going to give away its religious liberties again. From that point on, Britain is a true constitutional monarchy in the modern sense. They don't have universal suffrage yet. That's going to be a long time coming, just like how we don't have it at the start in the US. But that set the ball rolling. And it started by Puritans. And in New England, you get the foundation of Puritan colonies, self-governing Republican Puritan colonies that end up becoming the core of the American Revolution alongside other colonies like Virginia. There was a misconception in the past. A sociologist named Max Weber explained Protestantism's economic success through what he called a Protestant work ethic. He believed that Calvinist theology promoted people working harder. And Weber was discredited. His theory was wrong. But Weber was looking in the right direction, and it was Quran who made sense out of this. Because when he combined it with Asimoglu's story about institutions, it all becomes clear. A freeing up of religious institutions went hand in hand with violent resistance to tyranny in Europe that brought about the first modern inclusive institutions. European democracy and republicanism had died with Greece and Rome. And the Protestant Reformation brings it back because you get people fighting for a say. At first, it's fighting for the rights of their own conscience and a right to have a say in how their church is run. But it's going to become much more expansive through warfare, through struggle, to where eventually it's fighting for a say in how their lives are run, fighting for a voice in politics. And every country that adopts that adopts a highly capitalist economic system as well. And you can see the more radical the Protestantism, the more impact it has. It's a little hidden in the graphs because you might notice Catholic Ireland is rather rich. That's because it's a tax haven. The actual, real GDP of the country is a fair bit lower. And Norway is rather rich from oil. But at the time that this matters, back when religion and politics was still a major deal, it's the Calvinist parts that are putting everything in motion. And so this is how Northern Europe begins to break free. But in the next video, we'll turn our attention away from the old world and onto a new world, as we see how very different social structures resulted in very different colonies, to the point that one continent, North America, would soar, and another continent, South America and Central America, would fall. Now I'll see you in the next one.